The Scuttlebutt is proud to welcome Millerstown Pick Apart, a self-service salvage yard where you can get parts you need for your car, truck, or van at very attractive prices because you do the work. Bring your own wrenches, hammers, screwdrivers, sockets, jacks, drills, or whatever you need, except for torches, to wrestle out the parts you need for the vehicles in the yard. Millerstown Pick Apart was created 17 years ago to provide reasonably priced solutions for auto parts needs. Millerstown is the perfect fit for those seeking discount auto parts to repair their own vehicles. Millerstown has a huge inventory of cars, which they purchase from individuals, towing companies, and auctions, and from its sister auto salvage recycling operation. For hours, directions, inventory, parts availability, and pricing, you can go to pickapartyard.com. That's PICAPARTYARD, pickapartyard.com, or call 724-224-4777. That's pickapartyard.com or call 724-224-4777.
In my case, I would have never thought I was doing this, when I was riding around on tanks and stuff. It's so critical that the Army puts, or the military puts, all this effort into helping these families too.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of The Scuttlebutt. I'm your host, Sean Hall, Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. I say host, but we're going to do like we did in Season 3, and Catherine Guyon, the news anchor for WTRF in Wheeling and host of the Veterans Voices on YouTube, will be hosting our episode today, which we're super excited to talk about. Our representatives from the DPAA. We're going to give you all the information here in just a minute, but first, if you've been watching The Scuttlebutt and you've been enjoying it, please like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell on YouTube. And if you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, anything really that comes to mind, you can email me at Sean, that's SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. We will have links in the chat, and we'd love to hear from you about all the topics that we're going to be discussing today. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Catherine.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite days because it's when my work in TV and my work with the VBC collide. Every once in a while, you get a story that comes across your news desk that you just know is going to be special. So a few months ago, we received a press release from the DPAA that a service member named Private First Class John Sitars from Weirton, West Virginia, had been identified after, he passed away and his family believed he was lost. So in contacting his family, I also met our first guest, who is Jim Bell. He is an identification specialist with the U.S. Army. And I'm also pleased to introduce Sergeant First Class Sean Everett, who is a spokesperson for the DPAA, which, for those of you who don't know, stands for Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, but we'll call it the DPAA for short. So I would like to welcome both of you to the program and start off with a question that I'm sure a lot of people are wondering. I'll let you explain it. What is the DPAA?
Hi, Catherine. Thanks. Yeah, the DPAA, Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, our whole mission, the whole reason we exist is to account for the service members who are still missing from our past modern conflicts going all the way back to World War II. So that includes the Korean War, the Cold War, Vietnam, Desert Shield, Desert Storm. There are no POW MIAs currently from Afghanistan or Iraq, so that are military members. There are, I think, 3 contractors who are missing. So we keep an eye out for them as well. But yeah, our whole purpose is to find, recover, and bring home those service members who never made it home.
And we will get into a little bit more about how that's done in a second, but I want to bring in Jim as well, because he has a very interesting job, at least I think anyway. Once these service members are identified, then Jim has the honor and privilege, as you told me, of identifying the families and giving them more information about, how exactly their loved one passed away and where they were found and things like that. So Jim, tell us a little bit about your end of all of this.
Yeah, I work for the United States Army. So Sean works at Department of Defense level, DPA. We work hand in glove with those guys. His agency has a recovery mission. So when the DPA identifies a soldier that belongs to the Army, it comes to a section that I work in, and then I have the honor, the pleasure. I contact the family. I notify them that their loved one's been identified, and then I set up a meeting with them, and I actually go meet with the family, and I discuss all how the soldier was identified, the various methods, a little bit about the history of how he was lost and how he was recovered. And then after that, we discuss how they'd like him interred or buried, the funeral plans. So then I go with them through them with the mortuary affairs benefits that they get, and help them arrange for a funeral to honor the sacrifice of loved ones. So it's a great mission. I really, what I enjoy is I get to actually go talk to and visit with the families. And you mentioned John Sitar's, that was his sister. So that was a, very, very special meeting, wonderful family.
And obviously, this is an effort that's quite literally around the world. So where are you guys, and where all is this mission spread out at? Because I remember talking from you, Jim, that there's a lot of places, not only where the DPAA is searching for these service members, but also where they're doing the identifications and things like that. So where all in the world are we?
Jim, I'll let you go first, because my part is probably going to take a little bit longer.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Catherine, the case for John Sitar's was lost out of Germany. I mentioned I'm working a case later this week for a Korean War, Chosin Reservoir. I did a case recently in near West Virginia on the border there with Ohio for a soldier that was recovered from Burma. I've done New Guinea. I've done Tarawa, all through Europe, down in Italy, Croatia, but Sean has a better handle really of all the various places that they're doing recovery missions, and they also are doing disinterments. But it's amazing what DPA does, and Sean can tell you all those places where they're out searching.
Can you define for me disinterment?
Yeah, Sean, you can back me up on this. A disinterment, for example, there's 800 something soldiers that were laid to rest in the Punch Bowl. It's a national military cemetery of the Pacific.
National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific.
And so those soldiers are classified as unknown. They were laid to rest as unknown soldiers. They have headstones that say unknown, but DPA has these tremendous records from Korea, World War II, and they're constantly researching what we know about the unknown soldier. And then if they get enough evidence or information, then they'll get a disinterment, and they'll take the remains from the grave and then put them in the lab. And in the lab, they can run more modern day forensic tests. DNA is really the big one, but they're, Sean can mention the numbers, but they've got a major undertaking in the Punch Bowl in Hawaii, and then also in Europe on Hurtgen Forest was John Sitar's. John Sitar's was a disinterment. So he was lost in Hurtgen Forest, and that's one of the areas that the DPA analysts and historians are looking at to see what we can find out and get those remains to modern day lab. But hope I got that right, Sean.
Yeah, all that was perfect. Yeah, so I am actually physically located in the Washington D.C. area. That's where the Dpa headquarters is. Now we also have two major labs. We have a major lab at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam in Hawaii on Oahu, and then we also have another major lab at Offutt Air Force Base just outside of Omaha, Nebraska, and that's where all the remains that we analyze and identify, they all go through one of those two labs. Now we also have a smaller, it's not really a lab, but detachment at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and then we have detachments literally all over the world. We have a European detachment, and then we have a detachment in Vietnam. We have a detachment in Laos. We have a detachment in Cambodia, and then in addition to those, we also literally have teams that go all over the world. So, like Jim mentioned, we have teams that are currently working in Europe. We have teams that are out in Southeast Asia. We have teams that are in on islands in the Pacific Ocean. We have teams anywhere that we know of that we may have missing service members that we've been able to do the research and the investigation to find where they may possibly be. We have people out there. Now, we do partner with a lot of different organizations, schools, businesses, nonprofits, things like that, who also help us go out and do some of these recoveries. COVID's been especially challenging, not just, for everybody, but for us, just on the operational side of things, because we haven't been able to send out as many organic teams as we normally would. We've had several be able to go out this year, this spring and summer. But with the current resurgence, we're unfortunately having to cut back, and that's not that it's a mix between us and the countries that we're going into, because many of them are imposing stricter travel restrictions, even though we always make sure that we abide by all of the safety regulations between vaccinations and masks and quarantine when we get there, quarantine sometimes before we go, things like that. But yeah, we're literally all over the world, primarily Europe or the Pacific. But if there's someone missing from one of our past modern conflicts, then we are, whether we've gone there or we're researching it, there is a good chance that we at least know about it and are looking into the possibility of being able to get out there and recover those service members. A big part of it, from kind of what Jim said in the question about disinterment, is there are a lot of unknowns buried in American cemeteries all over the world, that we also try to identify, because those unknowns, yes, they are buried in an American cemetery. Their remains were fortunately recovered and unfortunately not able to be identified, and those service members still deserve to be identified, and their families deserve to know what happened to those service members. So there are American cemeteries all over Europe, several in Italy, several in France. There are a couple in Belgium, the Netherlands. Like I said, there are American cemeteries all over the world that are run by the American Battle Monuments Commission. And we work very closely with them to be able to disinter these unknowns and get them safely and securely from those cemeteries to our labs, whether the remains go to our lab at Offutt Air Force Base or Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. But yeah, all over the world, there's also an American cemetery in Manila in the Philippines that we've been doing a lot of World War II work out of. And yeah, like I said, we're just all over the world.
Last I checked, and I know this number fortunately goes down quite frequently, but last I checked as of yesterday, there are still 81,600 service members that are unidentified. So I'm curious as to how, obviously this is not a fast process, but as to how quickly this works, because Jim, you said you're working on multiple cases right now, and I feel like just our news station in the last several months, we've gotten multiple press releases for different soldiers from West Virginia and Ohio being identified. So how quickly does this process move?
So really, the speed of the process depends. It really depends on the case. It depends on if it's a disinterment, if it's an actual field recovery mission. Depends on if we have DNA family reference samples from members of that service member's family. There's a lot of different things, different factors that go into how long it takes. Now, going back to the over 81,600 service members still missing, I do want to put a caveat to that number that roughly half of that number were lost at sea and are considered unrecoverable. So they were, whether it be in plane crashes in deep water or ships being sunk in deep water. A lot of that, like I said, about half of that big 81,000 number are lost at sea. And unfortunately, with current technology and safety regulations and things like that, most of those, if we can even find them, would not necessarily be recoverable. And I know, at least on the Navy side of things, the ships that are lost at sea, those wrecks, those ships are considered the final resting place of those soldiers, similar to the USS Arizona that's in Pearl Harbor, where the majority of the crew that went down with that ship, they are still interred there on the ship, and that is considered their final resting place. But then, of the almost 40,000 that are considered recoverable, again, it really just sort of depends on the circumstances and things like that. So we have numerous projects. One of our big projects over the last 6 years that we're actually getting close to the end of has been the Uss Oklahoma Project. There were 394 service members from the USS Oklahoma who were recovered, but were unable to be identified after the December 7th, 1941 bombing of Pearl Harbor. And those 394 sailors and Marines were buried as unknowns at the Punch Bowl Cemetery there in Honolulu. And we've had, since 2015, our USS Oklahoma project that has, we disinterred all of the USS Oklahoma remains. Now, between 2003 and 2015, there were some, so I guess, sort of test cases for the USS Oklahoma that had been disinterred, and 6 sailors and Marines out of those test cases had been identified. One of the issues with the USS Oklahoma project is called commingling. And that's something we find in, I won't say all of, but a good number of cases from all over the world. And what commingling means there is one casket, but there are multiple service members buried in that casket. Now, it's not that, their bones were just sort of dumped in there and mixed together, but back in the 40s, their forensic anthropology and things like that were not as advanced as we are today. And so they would, as best they could, try to identify service members. But there are times where either space required that the remains that can be identified as being part of one person were, several sets of remains were put in the same casket. Now, they were kept separately. They're usually folded in, those green army blankets that the Army still uses today. They're usually folded within one of those and placed in the casket, but there may be several of those. But there are other times when has been what looks like a full skeleton in one of those caskets, and you think, oh, good, okay, that's a single person. But then we go and we do the forensic analysis. Our scientists do the forensic analysis, the forensic odontology, which is the looking at the teeth and things like that. And just through that forensic anthropological analysis, we realized that there could be multiple people. In fact, I want to say there was one USS Oklahoma case where there was like 80 people that were represented in one casket.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, part of that is because, a lot of those recoveries from the USS Oklahoma were recovered long after the December 7th bombing, and, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, sometimes even, a year, 2 or 3 later. So by the time those remains were found, unfortunately, there was nothing left but skeletal remains. But yeah, it's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle where you might not necessarily have all the pieces.
Jim, how early in the process do you get involved in contacting the families? I mean, do you contact them when there's like a suspicion that, hey, this may be your loved one, to connect to get more DNA evidence? Or like, how early do you make that contact with the families? Because I'd imagine there's a fine line between like wanting to contact them, but also like you don't want to unnecessarily get their hopes up, I would think.
Yeah, well, I work for Past Conflicts Repatriation Branch within the Casualty Branch of the Army. So we have case managers that have in the database all the missing in action soldiers for the Army. And then these case managers reach out and maintain contact with these family members and seek DNA and provide them outreach. DPA also hosts family member updates throughout the nation where missing families are invited and they can go talk to the scientists and they can talk to the military representatives. But we maintain this database when necessary. The lab that DPA has, when they get close to a identification or if they have a candidate, then they'll reach out to us to make sure we have family reference samples, and those are the DNA samples. So sometimes we hire genealogists that go build a family tree to find out who the next of kin are. So we have a database with all these, and normally when the laboratory is close to making identification, they kind of give us a heads up so that we're better prepared. Now, I don't contact, the identifications section does not contact a family member until the identification's made. So when I contact the family, we know we have a positive ID. And something Sean said that triggered a thought with me. When I meet with a family, after I notify them, I meet with them, but all those reports Sean talked about, so normally there would be a historical report where the soldier was lost and how he was recovered. And then there's a separate report, anthropology, which is remains with photos. And then there's odontology oftentimes of the teeth with photos. There's a DNA report. And then sometimes there's something called a chest x-ray. If a soldier's found with dog tags or uniforms or bayonet, rifle, that sort of thing, there's a scientists that work for the labs that are expert in those items, and that would report. So when I meet with a family, I show them all that stuff. I show them the photos. I show them all the evidence, and then go through in detail, what the report tells it. So it's pretty amazing what the labs and DPA does. When we meet with the families, it's very in-depth and full of information. And we leave the book with the family too, so they have it to share with other family and do what they wish. But it's a great mission, and the labs do wonderful work, and it's amazing what they can identify nowadays too.
At one point, did the forensic science sort of advance far enough that the mission started, I guess, becoming easier? The remains got identified a lot faster.
So back in, I want to say it was in the 90s, we partnered with the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System, and their Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory. We call them, the acronym for them is AFMES, just shorter than saying the whole thing out every time, kind of like DPAA.
Everything in the military, really. But
right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, but so we partner with AFMES, and they have been they've been the laboratory that we send all of our DNA samples to, and they do all of the DNA analysis and DNA identification for our mission. So not just for the Army, but for everybody, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force. We've even identified a couple of Coast Guardsmen from back in World War II. So a couple of civilians from Vietnam as well. So back in the 90s is when we started partnering with AFMES to do the DNA identification, and that's when that's really, I think, when it got easier. Now, DNA is not the only tool that we use. We use multiple lines of evidence. We do the forensic anthropological analysis, the forensic odontology, the forensic dentistry, material evidence, like Jim mentioned, circumstantial evidence, where they were found or where they were buried. There's many different lines of evidence that come together for us to be able to make an identification. But without a doubt, the DNA identification was definitely the point where it made it much easier for us to get those IDs that probably would not have been possible in the past.
Right.
Hey,
And are
hey,
you
Sean,
using, sorry, a follow-up question. Are you using DNA from like the family to sort of help match that? So they sort of, because I wouldn't think that they took DNA back in World War II of the soldiers.
No, they didn't. We have to take DNA samples from the remains that we get. And we'll take a sample of the remains, and those samples will get sent to AFME's lab, which is in Dover, Delaware, and they will then analyze those samples and then compare the DNA. And now, if they're able to get DNA, which they often are, if they're able to get DNA out of those samples, they will then analyze that DNA and then compare it to the database of family reference samples that the different service casualty offices, such as what Jim works for the Army, they've been, in contact with these families and gotten the families to submit DNA reference samples, or sometimes the families will reach out to the SCOs. That's what we call the service casualty offices. They'll reach out to the SCOs and volunteer their DNA. So it really it kind of works both ways. But yeah, the DNA is definitely where I guess if you could say turned a corner towards getting more identifications, that's probably it.
Sean Everett brings up a good point, because a lot of cases we don't have DNA. The DNA doesn't, they just can't get it from the remains for whatever reason. But what they can do is amazing. I was able, Aftil got DNA. It was a B-24 pilot lost off the coast of Croatia in about 100 feet of water, and they were still able to get DNA. But what came to mind was I've had cases, for example, a fighter pilot. So a fighter aircraft would be a one-man airplane, and they'll come upon a crash site and they'll find the data plate, and the records kept in World War II are amazing. So they'll find the data plate. We know it's the pilot's fighter plane. And then we might find other evidence, but we don't have enough remains to get a DNA match. But in that case, because of the evidence of the equipment found and the crash location site, then the lab will make an identification. So I've briefed many cases. Most of them are air crewmen from World War II. But in cases like that, we don't have DNA, but there's enough other evidence to get a match.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And then what Sean said too, like even if DNA is just a part of it. So if the anthropologist and the odontologist, they all do it independent. And then if the evidence doesn't match up where they all come together, or the historian, if the remains are found where they shouldn't have been found, they all come together like a team, and the medical examiner, looks at what they have to make a determination. But I think DNA is kind of the game changer. And I've seen advancements in DNA since I've started working, to where IDs are made now that maybe couldn't have been made a few years back.
Jim, I'm going to ask you to explain something you said to the civilian over here. When you say a data plate with the planes, what does that mean? That's a term that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, when I came to this job, I was kind of shocked, but in World War II, especially, they're called MACRs, missing aircrew reports. But when an airplane went on a mission, they knew who was on board the plane, and they kept serial numbers of the plane, they kept serial numbers of the engines, they kept serial numbers of the weapons. So a data plate, I had a crash site in France, and it was a special kind of airplane. It was a Spitfire, which is a British fighter plane. So it's kind of unusual for an American to be flying it, but he was. But they found all these varied data serial numbers, the serial numbers to the radio, serial number to the weapon, serial number to the airplane. And then the experts could tell by the type airplane it was a Spitfire. So they connected all the dots, and then the historian said, yep, that's where he was seen crashing. So the ID was made. In that case, we eventually got DNA later too, but even without the DNA, there was enough evidence there for the identification. So yeah, the data plate's just basically, if you look in your car, on the engine, everything's got serial numbers to it. It's crazy, but we kept records of all that stuff that now pays off for the modern day historians and analysts.
I feel like there's two parts to this mission that all of you guys are on. There's the scientific element, which is so incredible, but then there's also the human element and just the emotion of it, because I'm sure emotions kind of run the gamut when you meet with these families. So Jim, like, what's that like when you're able to finally go meet these families and see them in person after speaking with them on the phone, but also like bring them all that information and also bring them that kind of sense of peace that like, hey, we finally get to lay our loved one to rest the way we want to.
Yeah, it's I've done over 100 cases now. So John Sitar's is a good example. It's a sister, but I was mostly dealing with a niece of the soldier, which was the sister's daughter. So I did a lot of telephonic coordination with her. But when I walked in the door and I had a casualty assistance officer, I have a uniformed soldier with me. When I walked in the door, I kind of felt like I knew them already, and they treated me like I was family. But the biggest emotion is I've had families tell me not to use the word closure, but it is kind of like a closure. They've been waiting all these years, and then I bring it with this, this report is very in depth, so I can go through the details of how the soldier was lost and where he's been for all these years, and this is how we know it's him. And then to plan a funeral is often a big deal, brings a lot of emotion. But yeah, to me, it's very rewarding, but the families are also, it's a special generation. The World War II and the Korean War generations are, I don't know. Every case I've been on, I think it's been the best I've been on, but they're all, I'd say all 100 are like that. I hear a lot of comments where the mother, usually it's the soldier's mother or the soldier's father. I'll hear comments that the mother, I wish she was here to see this day, or I would remember her on every Christmas or on the soldier's birthday would be in a depression type state. I've heard where the mothers often always looked at the door hoping that he'd come walking through the door. And then I hear on the father's side, families say, I've never seen my father cry except, when the news came. And some of them, they just always they have hope, that we'll find the soldier. So, I kind of like when I'm the guy making the call, it's good news. I'm bringing them good news. And when I finally get to meet him, it's, if you could see the book for Sitar's, it's very in depth.
We'll make sure to post that story that Catherine reported on in this YouTube chat here, if you're interested in checking out Sitar's story. It's a great video, Catherine. You did a wonderful job with that.
Good.
No, thank you.
And I'm interested in how Sean and Jim, how both of you got involved in this. I would think, because we've talked a lot of EBC about how it's really drilled into enlistees and draftees, leave no man behind. That's sort of like, that's what you leave no soldier behind. Is that part of it? You're Sean, you're still active duty. Jim, you're a veteran. Is that sort of part of the passion you bring to this job, that you're not leaving someone behind?
So part of it for me, that absolutely is, one of the reasons that this job matters, is because it helps, as an active duty service member, it does kind of help bring me a little bit of comfort, knowing that if I were to go to a war zone and would go missing, that there is an agency out there whose sole job is to find me and bring me home to my family. And so, like I said, it does bring a little bit of comfort. Now, as to how I got involved, quite honestly, I was up for assignment from the last place that I was stationed, and the Army Public Affairs branch said that, figured that I would be a good fit here for DPAA with the kind of work that we do and the kind of stuff that I have to do on the public affairs side. And so, but I will say, but I've known about this mission the entire time I've been in the Army. So I've been in the Army almost 14 years, been in active duty almost 19 years. I actually started out in the Navy back in the 90s and then had a break in service. But I've been in the Army almost 14 years. And so, I've known about this mission since the very beginning, and was always bummed because I had no idea that they actually had an enlisted public affairs slot for this mission. And I was like, man, I wish I could get stationed there so that I could do that mission, because that mission sounds extremely cool and like it would be very satisfying. And then when I found out that they indeed do have a public affairs enlisted position, and that I was selected for it, I was very, very happy and very excited to be able to come and work this mission for a while.
Yeah, and,
Jim, how did you end up here?
yeah, I'm a retired veteran. Did 22 years retired. I'm a tank guy, so this was not my expertise. I did grow up on the tenet, no one left behind. And a lot of cases like John Sitar's was lost in Hurtgen Forest. We left a whole lot of soldiers in the Hurtgen because we were not able to recover them. Either they were lost in the thick woods, or the enemy, the Germans, held the area and we were not able to go back and recover them. So that's a shame, and that's not the norm that Sean Everett and I were raised on. You know, we normally go to great lengths to bring back our wounded and our deceased. And in case of John Sitar's, we just weren't. And we're doing a lot of cases in Chosin Reservoir in Korea, and we left countless soldiers back. We intended to go back and get them, but we just couldn't. The conditions were so bad that we just were not able to. So now we're doing it, 70 years later. But to me, I find it very rewarding. I feel very proud that, to be an American in the U.S. military, in the Army, but, the Department of Defense, that the U.S. military goes to all this effort to account for these soldiers, because, I mean, it's amazing the work that Dpa does. So yeah, it brings me great pride that I get to be part of this. Now, the way I came upon it's kind of, to be honest, when I retired from the Army, I'm a tank guy, but Human Resources Command came to Fort Knox, Kentucky. That's the big administrative command in the Army. Part of that is casualties. And during the height of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, they needed help. So I was a program manager of a contract. So I had about 32 employees that were working in the casualty branch. Now, all my employees were working current cases, Afghanistan and Iraq. And they were case managers working with the families and the casualty assistance offices throughout the nation. So that's how I came into casualties. But when I went up there, I felt like a fish out of water. But then I learned how important the casualty section was to these families. Even though I served in the Army, I've dealt with casualties in the real world when I was in uniform, but it was someone else handled the details. So now I was learning all those details. And then the way I came into this job was as a contractor. I would constantly walk through the casualty branch at Fort Knox, Kentucky. That's where Human Resources Command is located. And I would see pictures of recoveries and of skeletons and remains and crash sites and airplanes. And I'm a history major from college days, and I used to find interest. So I started talking to identifications guys, and they said, "Yeah, this is what we do." So when that job came available, I was like, "Man, I kind of like Sean Everett, you kind of politic to get a job like this." And I was fortunate to get it. And, now, for me to say I'm kind of like I work casualties, when I tell friends and family, "What do you do?" And I say, "Well, I'm a mortuary affairs officer," they kind of look at you like, "Oh man, that's kind of, poor you." And I say, "No, like I mentioned earlier, I'm the guy that when I make the phone call, it's a good phone call. It's I'm bringing good news as compared to what I was doing when I first came to casualty branch." But yeah, in my case, I would have never thought I was doing this, when I was riding around on tanks and stuff. But I do love it. And actually, I would say I love the current operations too. I mean, it's very sad, and we see a lot of bad stories. But when I was down there, I mean, it's so critical that the Army or the military puts all this effort into helping these families too. So. Yeah.
Now, are a lot of these service members that are recovered, are they buried at Arlington, or is it just up to the family's personal preference? Like, are you guys able to arrange that for them if they choose to be buried at Arlington?
Yeah, I guess I'll take that one. Yes, Arlington Cemetery is an option. So the family has an option for a private cemetery, for example, with family. Then they have an option for a veteran cemetery or a national cemetery. And Arlington is one of those places. Now, if they go to Arlington, they get full military honors. So they get a little church service, and then they get the casket on the caisson, which is a horse-drawn caisson. And in the case of the Army or all branches of the military, in our case, it's the old guard that performs the ceremony. So the old guard is the same type of folks that, do the presidents and the VIPs. And I've been blessed. I got to go to an Arlington funeral for one of my cases, and it's fantastic. But some families, they don't want that. They prefer like the soldier buried with mom or dad. I'd say usually it's mom. So the Sitars is going to Arlington National Cemetery, but the case I worked last week is being laid to rest in a small town in Ohio next to his mother. So I'd say the majority go to private cemeteries or family cemeteries, but you know, it is the family's choice, and the Army, you know, pays for it. So we make the arrangements wherever it's going to be.
Yeah, I've never personally witnessed a funeral in Arlington, but I've seen images from it. And that's such a, you know, for people that haven't seen it, it's such a powerful moment. And it seems no matter where, you know, these service members are buried, it just seems like such a, you know, a fitting end to have them finally be able to rest with honor with their families.
Yeah, it's, I mean, for people listening, if they've never been to Arlington, if I go to Washington, D.C., I always go. I have friends laid to rest there, so I go pay my respects. But yeah, if a funeral is taking place, tourists are able to watch. You know, so I was there for a Marine Corps person, but then the case I was working where it was my soldier being laid to rest, you know, the Arlington lets people come up and observe. So I would definitely recommend it to others to go to Arlington and to watch a funeral if they can. Something else I'd like to mention to you: when these remains are either in Offutt Air Force Base or in Hawaii, when the remains come to the States to the funeral, there's a ceremony. So when they hit an airport like Dallas or Charlotte or Reagan up in DC, they are met by an honors team that takes the casket from the plane and puts in a hearse. And there's a ceremony done for the soldiers. When the casket comes from the lab, it's escorted. So there's a uniformed soldier that accompanies the remains all the way back to the funeral location. So the families are able to go see that ceremony too. So these remains are handled with honors the whole way. It's pretty incredible. And I would say a lot of airports, Dallas is one, Charlotte's another, where the airline has an honors team too. So all the old veterans that work for the airline come out and have an honor team that stands to the side while the Army you know, takes care of the remains. But yeah, it's a pretty incredible and very emotional for the family, and it means a lot that that all this effort. And then while I'm on it, if it's an air crewman from World War II, they're entitled to a flyover. So for air crewmen lost in World War II, in the case of the Army, I go to U.S. Air Force, and then when mission allows it, which is probably most of the time, the Air Force has an aircraft that flies over the cemetery when the family's there. So our cases get full military honors, but they go all out. And Arlington definitely is a pretty special place, but the family gets to choose where that's going to be.
You mentioned that the families have said that you shouldn't use the word closure. I'm interested as to why.
Yeah, I used it. I'd say I had two cases where I used closure, and I think it was a sibling. It was a sister, I believe, and it got them annoyed that I used closure, because in her case, she said it'll never be over. You brought him home, but he should have never been in Korea, or you know. So I'm cautious with that. You know, grief is kind of interesting even after all these years. I saw it a lot when I did current operations, but even today, you know, out of maybe 100+ cases, I've only had a couple where there was people that were angry at the Army or the military or the circumstances. So that's why I'm cautious in using that term, because you know I am not the family member. I'm there bringing them the news. But it to me is.
I was going to say, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Sometimes when we're talking about that portion of things from DPAA, we say, you know, we don't always bring the family closure, but we do bring them answers so that they know what happened to their service member.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, Sean nailed it, because we bring them answers, but sometimes the answers, like Chosin Reservoir was awful. Hurtgen Forest was awful, where John Sitars came from, but you know what we're telling them about how the loved one was lost is can be very rough. And then sometimes remains are not, if there's trauma to the remains, I've seen remain skeletons, if you will, where it's clear that you can tell how they were lost, how they were killed in action. And it's my job to take that, and I always warn the family, hey, we're going to look at remains. Are you okay with that? Some are and some are not. But if there's trauma, my duty is to go through and explain, okay, there was trauma, and this is how your loved one was lost, we believe. That can be very difficult. Sometimes, not very often in my cases, but sometimes it does, create anger, if you will.
Right.
And it can be tough. It's very tough usually with brothers, sisters, and I've had a daughter and children, to go through that part. Honestly, some people don't like looking at the skeletal remains. They just don't. So
I'm sure it brings up a lot of emotions that have potentially been buried or not thought of for a long time.
Yeah, one of my most interesting cases was a Korean War soldier. He was a Native American. He was from the Sioux Indian tribe in South Dakota, and it was his sister. He was lost to Korea. But when I took the report to her, and the good news is it was a pretty complete skeleton, because they're not always, as Sean mentioned, sometimes they're commingled, and sometimes we don't have a whole lot. But in this case, it was fairly complete, so you could kind of tell. And I just remember I had the book with the photo, and she just kept rubbing the photo. It was like, for her to see it, was really all that mattered. I mean, she couldn't wait to see that part, skip through all the other stuff, and she just, kind of lovingly kept rubbing the pictures of the skeleton. So, I've seen a lot of interesting things, but, strong feelings, but again, it brings me pride to see that it means that much to these families. So.
And that's what has to keep, everyone that works with you guys going, I'd imagine, because there's so many service members left to be recovered. But at the same time, every time you are able to make an identification and bring that to that family, like knowing you're doing that, I'd imagine has to be so motivating to keep going, because I know this is not easy work.
Yeah, I mean, what's difficult now too is the World War II and Korean generation are getting up in the years. So, a lot of the siblings, we don't, I have dealt with mothers before, but, usually at this point there might be siblings. But even those, because of the age, are, not as many around. So sometimes we get down to nephews and nieces and cousins. But what I find interesting, even when I work with, say, a nephew or a niece that might have never known the soldier, they know all the stories about him because I always heard it from the grandparents and, from their parents, about how important it was. So when the ID is made, that's where you hear, I wish mom was here to see this. But they take great pride that now they get to handle it for, it's a big deal. So even people that weren't alive during the Korean War, World War II, I mean, when we let them know we're coming with an ID, it's huge to them, which kind of makes it even more special for me.
There's that element too of passing family history down, because like the amount of information that you're able to give them, not only from a personal context, but like from a historical context, for them to have that and be able to pass those stories down of people in their family that served and where they were and how they passed, that has to be, it's almost like an element of passing along history, because then they'll be able to tell it to future generations, like, hey, your great great uncle, great great grandfather, whatever, this is what they did for our country.
Yeah, that's a good point. The case I did in Ohio, for whatever reason, the family kind of scattered, as it does. So in this case, it was a sibling, but since I briefed the family, part of what we do, we're real big on privacy. So, there is drama sometimes. I'll say there's drama, but when there's not, oftentimes when your news stories hit, I'll start getting phone calls. Like in your case, your news story hit, and I got calls from people that wanted to pay their respects, but others that were relatives. And the sibling was an older 90. You remember her? She's a sweet lady. So people say, hey, I believe I'm related. So when I'm able, I can help, connect the family to the primary next kin. And then this story kind of brings them together. The one I just did, I think they're going to use it as a kind of a family reunion because there's parts of the family that have not talked to one another. So
the family reunion thing, I won't say it happens all the time because it probably happens less than it doesn't. But yeah, I have seen several occasions where the families will use, I guess, use the funeral as an excuse to basically have a family reunion.
Absolutely.
There was an ANC funeral, an Arlington funeral back in the summer at some point where there was like 130 people at that funeral, because the family came from all corners of the United States to be there at the funeral. And some of them, in talking to the family a little bit before and after, some of those folks had not seen each other in like 20, 30 years. And so, there are occasions while, ultimately a funeral is not a particularly happy occasion, there are occasions where, times where joy does come out of this for some of the families, if only because they get to reconnect with people that either they had never been connected with in the past or they haven't seen in a long time.
Yeah. And I'm sure there are probably, fellow servicemen, maybe, or women who may have served with the lost soldier, who might be a part of that as well, that the family might get to meet, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, Sean, that's a good point. Veterans are special people, you know that. So I'm in a case in South Carolina, and I went to college in South Carolina, so it's kind of like a home. I'm with the family. It's a brother. He never talked about his missing brother. So all his friends in this little town in South Carolina didn't even know he had a brother. So when the news story broke, people came to him and said, "I didn't know you had a brother." And he said, "Well, too painful to talk about." And the family, when they decided to have him laid to rest with his mom and dad in this little town, and they were worried, they said, "Well, there's not many of us left." And I said, "Sir, there's probably going to be people that want to pay their respects. That's how veterans are." And there's 300 people at the cemetery. Now, they weren't family, but they were just veterans and people from the town and people interested that just came to pay their respects. Mm-hmm. Then we had the Patriot Guard there too, that, some motorcycle group that flies the flags and escorts remains oftentimes. But this family was blown away, but I can see that all the time. And like what Sean said, for a family to come together for Arlington, that's a big deal. I see when we have some funerals in Arlington, it seems to be, everybody in the family wants to be involved to be there. But I'd say that for private cemeteries too. But yeah, it's not only families that come together, but it's all these veterans that just, it amazes me. I think it's pretty cool,
Yeah, when we send out the press releases like what you all got about sitars, when we send those out, I send those not only to the media, but I have a regular distro list that is full of people from veteran service organizations and organizations like the National League of Families, who the POW MIA flag that that is even part of the DPA logo, that's their flag. But I have a whole list of people from these veteran service organization and these family organizations that these press releases go to, and they help spread the word. And a lot of times they will, some of them will also organize, like Jim said, getting other veterans to come to these funerals to pay their respects.
You've taken a look and researched onto the Dpa website, and I'm very impressed with the amount of information and different things that you can find out about those who have been recovered, who are still lost, data, graphs, information, facts, frequently asked questions. There's a lot of information on this website that we will link to. But Sean, I thought you might take a minute to just sort of walk us through some of the highlights of the website, and what a civilian like myself, if I'm interested in going on the website, what can I find? What should I look for? What should I be clicking for?
Yeah, so to kind of tout the parts of the website that I directly affect most often, all the releases for every service member that we identify gets a DPA news release done about their accounting and their identification. And so I know every person that we've accounted for in the last 2 years, which I've been at DC, or I've been at DPA for right at 2 years. Every person that we have accounted for goes on this website. So the part you're looking at right now, that's our recently accounted for. Literally every person that we account for, once their families are kind of notified, and this is Jim's area, but are kind of notified in a couple of stages. They're first notified telephonically just to let them know, hey, your service member's been identified, and then there's then they get a full briefing, which before COVID was in person, and now sometimes it's in person, sometimes it's via Zoom or MS Teams or something like that. Like I said, that's more Jim's area of things. But once they get telephonically notified, we put a notification on our website on that recently accounted for list, and then there's another section of the website called releases, where we put a shorter press release. And then once the family has their larger full briefing, where the casualty officer like Jim gets to show them all the photos and goes through the book of accumulated information with them. Once we get a notification that has happened, then we will put out a longer release that goes more into where their remains might have been and how they were found, how they were recovered, what we use to identify them, anthropological analysis, dental analysis, DNA, material evidence, circumstantial evidence, all those things. That'll go up there on the website, and then that longer release is the one that gets sent out to the media and to those veteran and family service organizations. So that's the part that I affect the most. But then, we'll take photos. We'll either take the photos ourselves from our office here in DC, or we have a lot of photographers out in Hawaii. But we have that banner up there that shows different things that DPA has been doing over the last 2 or 3 weeks. The photos that are on that front banner. But then if you are just interested in finding out more about the different conflicts and what we're doing to research those conflicts, there's FAQs and fact sheets about the different conflicts. There are there's maps that we have, an interactive map in our past conflict section. There are literally lists that can be found broken down either by service or by state, for each conflict, each war, each conflict has their own lists of how everything is broken down, often of both those who are still unaccounted for and those who have been accounted for. So there's, like you said, there is all kinds of information on our website. You really, if you went and really started digging down and everything, you could probably spend hours on our website and not see everything.
Well, Jim and Sean, I want to thank you both for, the work that you do and the mission that you're on and everything you're doing for, these families of these service members. It really is wonderful to hear and learn more about. And I would encourage everybody to go on the DPA website and take a look at some of those press releases, because I have, once we got the press release about private sitars, I went through and read a couple, and it's really just a good way, I think, at least from our perspective, to honor their memory and at least learn a little bit more about who these people were and how they passed and how they're finally going to join their family. So I would encourage everybody to just, even if you don't have hours, maybe just take a little bit and peruse the website.
Yeah, absolutely. We also have a Facebook page. It's facebook.com/DODPAA. And we put all the notifications for all the people that we identified. They go on our Facebook page, and we also put other articles and photos and stories of different things to do with our mission up there. So definitely check that out if you're interested in what we're doing, because pretty much everything we do, or I won't say everything, but a lot of the stuff we do goes up on our Facebook page as well.
And I should mention that actually this episode is going to be released right near a National POW MIA Recognition Day, which I'm guessing is a pretty busy day for you both.
Absolutely. So we're doing our annual Vietnam government briefings Wednesday and Thursday of next week, and this is kind of like Jim had mentioned earlier, a family member update. And what those and this briefings are is it gives us a chance to get together with families. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we're not doing it all in person like we normally would pre-COVID. It's going to be mostly virtual, done through live streamed both on our Facebook page and on the Dpa website. But it's our chance to get together with families and let them know what's going on, both in general, and then if the family wishes, they can also get a one-on-one meeting to find out what's going on with their specific case with their service casualty officer. But we're doing that next week, and then on Friday next week is POW MIA Recognition Day. And like you said, that is a big day for us. We do a big poster for that every year, which also is a thing that you can see on our website. If you go to dpa.mil and scroll down just a little bit, you'll see there's a button there where it says posters are available. You can always order a poster from us. It's absolutely free. But then also that poster is specifically for POW MIA Recognition Day. This year there's going to be a ceremony at the Pentagon. There's almost always a ceremony here in DC. This year it's going to be at the Pentagon. And like I said, unfortunately, because of COVID, there's not going to be as many people that are going to be allowed to be there in person, but it is going to be live streamed. And then we're also doing another ceremony at our facility out in Hawaii that'll happen later that same day, just Hawaii time. But yeah, the page that you're looking at now, you can download a high-res version of the poster there, download the 2021 poster, or you can order the poster and we will send you. We have large ones, we have small ones. We'll send you some copies of the poster. But at this point, though, if you order right now, I'm not going to lie, it's probably not going to get there in time for POW MIA Recognition Day next Friday, because unfortunately they don't get shipped out next day air. That would just be prohibitively expensive. But you can still order one if it's something, if somebody sees it and wants it as a keepsake or something. They'll be available until we're just out of stock. So.
Great. Well, thank you both again, and thanks for joining us here on the Scuttlebutt. And for all of our listeners out there, we hope in addition to checking out the DPAA's page and liking their Facebook, you also check out the BBC's content and the Scuttlebutt. And we will be posting, like Sean mentioned, links for not only probably the DPAA website, but also the story of Private Sitar's that we have been referencing throughout that everybody can check out. He has a truly remarkable story that we were able to speak to his family.
Thank you, Catherine, for hosting this episode. And also make sure you check out Veterans Voices that Catherine does on YouTube. Looking forward to more episodes of the Scuttlebutt. Please like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you, Sean, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. Thank you once again to Sean and Jim for joining us. And we look forward to seeing our audience again in the future. I want to thank Millerstown Pick Apart for their generous support and sponsorship of this program. For Millerstown's hours, direction, inventory, and pricing, go to pickapartyard.com. That's PICAPARTYARD.com. Thank you so much, Millerstown, and we'll see you on the next Scuttlebutt.